Hello, everybody. So I thought it'd be interesting to get a little perspective on how community ecology can work. And one of the ways I thought it would be fun to do that was by looking at some of the research that I've done in the past. So that it, sees how ecology can be done from start to finish, and then looks at, you get a little different perspective of what I like to do and what I've done in the past. So all of this, what we're going to be talking about today, is coming from an article that I published in Freshwater Biology. Um, and this will actually be the PLQ article that we'll be doing for this week, basically. So all this research really takes place in Playa wetlands. So what is a Playa wetland? Well, it's an ephemeral wetland, meaning it lasts for a very short amount of time, and it can be dry for maybe a year, maybe 10 years, maybe several decades before um, it gets water. They're relatively small habitats. They're really homogeneous. So this is me. This isn't that big of a little wetland, and it's pretty much just a circle with water, a couple feet deep maybe. And there's some plants around the edge, but all the rest of it is non. There isn't plants. So there's not that many organisms that can actually survive in this habitat where it's a small harsh habitat gets dried up. Um, so this work, though, is coming basically from a bigger study where I looked at the community dynamics over a large spatial scale. This study here that I'm talking about today is really concentrated in the northeastern corner of Colorado. In a smaller spatial scale, and I looked at the large scale drivers of what's happening in the food web. And then there were two other portions of the study, but I'm not going to talk about those today. So the cool thing about playa wetlands is they have this really interesting suite of organisms. They have fairy shrimp. You might know them as sea monkeys, tadpole shrimp, clam shrimp. And these are hatch out right away, really quick, and really quickly dominate the system. Um, they hatch out from these just dry eggs that can be dried and taken all sorts of different places. And then there are insects and other smaller crustaceans that will colonize the habitat throughout the hydro period. So that word hydroperiod, though, is really talking about the time that the wetland actually has water. So this is a picture of the same wetland taken from slightly different angles. You can see maybe there's these are those windmills, but this is just a couple weeks apart. I think this was in May and this was in June. So what happens is the habitat, a thunderstorm comes along, dumps a bunch of water, habitat fills up with water. It's a depression, right? So there's no outlet to this it's a very small watershed. But then a couple weeks and the water goes away. So I kind of wanted to know, well, okay, as the water goes away, everything is dying, right? These are a bunch of tadpole shrimp that have, they can't swim out of this playa wetland because it has no outlet. Organisms get trapped in these tiny little puddles all the time, and eventually they dry down and get smaller and smaller and smaller until there's no habitat left, or no aquatic habitat left. So what do these organisms do? So they have to have really high tolerance for the conditions are just pretty harsh. They also have to, or another way they can do it is by having these eggs that rest over a really long time period. So fairy shrimp eggs, they found old fairy shrimp eggs that are like over 30,000 years old at the bottom of the Salt Lake, um, near Salt Lake City, right? So these fairy shrimp eggs can last a very, very long time. The other option is like migration, right? So there's plenty of organisms that use these playa habitats that can fly away. So little waterfowl, little water birds. These are wading birds killed here, but the aquatic invertebrates that are living here, most of them can't do that. There are some insects that adult insects can fly out, but most of them, most of the organisms just have to figure out a different way to survive rather than migration. So there's been a decent amount of research on vernal pools out in California, and really most of the research out there and some of the research in the southern Great Plains has been really looking at mostly just diversity and how the populations, the communities grow and go away during the hydro period. But what I want to really look at in what a lot of my research revolves around is trophic structure. And what trophic structure is how a food web is built. So the who is there and then what those organisms are doing. So when you look at this really simple food web, right, we just have three players with two interactions going on here. You can know that the trophic structure of um, these two food webs here are very different, right? And we know that the one on the right is more complex, but how do we say that quantitatively? So the first question I was asking was, first off, the first aspect of trophic structure, you need to figure out what the organisms are there. So we can think of it, just a picture like this of what organisms we see there. And what we did with that was by looking at basically going out there, taking a net, and sweeping up all of the organisms that we could find. And most of the time, what we were just looking at was invertebrates, but then we also had some tadpoles of spadefoot toads, some salamanders and stuff. But mostly, what we were looking at was the invertebrate community here. Then we were measuring all sorts of various characteristics, size, depth, vegetation, disturbance area, all sorts of different things about the playas. But yeah, you'll see this presentation here. I'm really skimping on the methods. I'm not telling you that much, but you can figure that out when you read the article later on. So maybe for me what's a little bit more interesting then is what the organisms are doing. And what we can think of that is de-stressing what the organisms actually are, and we're really looking a lot more, paying more attention to these interactions. So how the food and the energy is flowing throughout the food web. And you'll see this relatively commonly done in community ecology, where organisms, the like specific species, doesn't really matter to a lot of community ecologists. It's just a number or of just one species of many, and we know that all species aren't equal, obviously, and they have um, different impacts on the system depending on how many organisms there are or individuals of that species there are. But a lot of the times we don't really care about who the actual individual species is. We're more concerned with these interactions. So for my research, what I oftentimes use to look at these interactions is stable isotopes. So if you look at a periodic table, you'll see something, this is the box for carbon. You'll see this 12 number, all right? And you say, well, carbon has 6 protons, and since it's 12 here, we know it has 6 neutrons. But why is this then 0.011? The answer to that is that carbon is actually made up of 2 stable isotopes and one radioactive isotope. So carbon-14 breaks down, but carbon-12 and carbon-13, which are the overall, carbon-12 is the overall huge majority of what carbon is. That's why this is so close to 12 here. but then there's a little bit of 13 and even less 14. Same with nitrogen. You have two stable isotope forms where you have, overwhelming majority carbon 14 with some 15 in there. Now, I don't really want to get into it, at least in this lecture, of what I actually did and how I used those stable isotopes. If you've taken my aquatic biology course, you might recognize this figure of looking at some of the things. For right now, let's just say use the stable isotopes to figure out specific characteristics of the food web. And I'll kind of just introduce them as we go along in the results section of this. So, when I went out there, went to Colorado, went to a bunch of these different playas. Some of them were very, very small, as you can see, but these were chock full of organisms. And what I wanted to determine was how long the water lasted when I was out there, because that's a huge determinant on who can actually live there, right? Um, a mosquito can grow in a tiny little container that only has water for a week, but a lot of these bigger insects, think like dragonfly larvae, or even some of like the tadpole shrimp, need several weeks of water. And now, most of the time, when we think about how big a habitat is, we think about its area. Okay, and so this was, just a surface area. How big was this pond? And when we looked at the total number of trophic strategies, so this is basically thinking about like how many different ways the organisms use food. We see there's no correlation here. So between area and the total number of ways, total trophic strategies, there was nothing here. But there was a pretty clear signal. There's a lot of variation here, as with lots of ecological data is like that. But there's a clear signal here that the deeper the playa gets, the more trophic strategies we have. So the more ways in which food is used by the whole community that's living in this little pond, or in all. I shouldn't say this little pond. In all of these different ponds, the ponds ranged in size, surface area size, from like something I could jump over to several football fields. So, but the depth, was somewhere between less than 10 centimeters up to about half a meter. So what we see is this increase in the total number of trophic strategies. Was that pattern was repeated with food chain length. So we had longer food chains in deeper playas, because these deeper playas have just more organisms in there, which we'll see why in a little bit. So, well, I wanted to see what was driving, if just overall biodiversity was driving aspects of the food web. And what I found was, when you look at just straight up species richness, so the number of species that are in these bios, oh, the food chain. This is the best association that I could find, that of the food chain, like how many like transfers of energy from plants to herbivores to carnivores to top predators. Like how big the food chain was, how long the food chain was, I should say. I didn't really find that much here. So it really didn't matter if we had a bunch of more species. It didn't really increase the the food chain length. But what I did see is that the crustaceans. So if there were a lot more, so this is just basically percent crustaceans. I know the x-axis is a little funny here. It's a transformation of the percent crustaceans. But the more crustaceans we had, the basically the shorter the food chain length was. So there's fewer transfers of energy if the habitat was dominated by these fairy shrimp, these clam shrimp, and the tadpole shrimp. Conversely, though, if we look at this, here is the food chain length here. This is like the total number of trophic strategies. We see a big increase as we increase the number of insects in the number of insect species in these playas. This is just the total number of insects, and then this is the insect richness. So the food chains are longer when we have more species. So, and it kind of makes sense because if you look into the biology of these specific, the fairy shrimp, the clam shrimp, and the tadpole shrimp, well, they kind of just eat things all the same way. They just grab everything that's up in the water, eat it, and they're just filter feeders. They're any kind of biological thing they can filter, they fit in their mouth, whether it's a tadpole shrimp, whether it's a fairy shrimp or clam shrimp. They all just do the same thing. That's not true though with the insects. Okay, what I have here is the trophic structure relies on the species-specific traits. So when we look at the different insect species, they come in and bring new strategies. So we have dragonfly larvae that are big predators in the system. These are kind of omnivorous diving beetles. The mosquito larvae are filter feeders also, but it really takes the insects to come in to really drive the things in the food web, the characteristics that we're measuring in the food web. So I kind of wanted to then to look at some human disturbance. So we kind of know what happens in the food webs themselves. What happens when we come in and screw it up? So I wanted to look at row crop agriculture. So if you plant corn, if you plant wheat within these playas or right next to these playas, what happens? What I found is that there was clear difference from plowed wetlands to unplowed wetlands. The journal I published this in is based out of England, so they made me spell plowed like this, but I would have used a W. Anyway, so in wetlands that had, agriculture, what we see is the CR here is referring to essentially the number of food sources that are available. And what we see is there's actually more food sources available in a plowed wetland, but what's driving that really is that now you just have corn and wheat available, whereas in an unplowed wetland you basically just have detritus and algae. And what we actually see is that there's fewer species. This metric here, the higher it is, actually means there's lower trophic redundancy. What that means is that there's not like backups. There's not a lot of different things eating the same thing. There's only a couple species, maybe one species that will be eating the food in a specific way. So there are certainly differences within the food web when we looked at agriculture, at least row crop agriculture. But what we saw is that grazing kind of had this opposite impact, where the wetlands, the playa wetlands that had cows active in the pond or recently in the pond, there was higher species richness and more invertebrates, more bugs in the water. And the communities were different. There was just more going on in these grazed wetlands. But the trophic structures themselves were identical. I won't go through all of a bunch of non-significant results. Basically, what we see is all the how energy is flowing through the food web is pretty much the same whether it's grazed or whether it's not. And I think this is really, interesting. Oops. Most people say, well, how can this be, right? Cows destroy these wetlands. And well, the wetland is not here in this stockyard. This is a picture of a playa wetland that is grazed, right? It looks like a relatively nice place. If you go up close, you can see that there's footprints from the cows that are coming in to drink this water. But here's a bunch of little ostracods living in this little footprint and able to survive a little bit longer because the footprints hold water for longer periods of time. So what's happening here? Well, the cows are coming into these wetlands, getting their feet muddy, picking up potentially whole adult organisms themselves in their muddy feet or the eggs that are left over. And what we see is that grazing actually is a good thing and might be, in ephemeral wetlands at least, um, in this part of the country, kind of think the Great Plains. We used to have bison there, so the cattle might be replicating, at least for a little bit, what bison were themselves doing, as where these wetlands, the communities evolved. So cattle, aren't necessarily all bad. So what I want to think though about is looking at what happens to the trophic structure then throughout the hydro period. So if we think about a thunderstorm coming, filling up a playa wetland, these crustaceans are hatching out, insects are coming in and colonizing, but then the pond starts to dry out. By this time, then basically the playa wetland is just a bunch of predators. That these big predators, dragonfly larvae, predaceous diving beetles, hydrophilid beetles, or these big tadpole shrimp, have essentially eaten all of these earlier successional species out. So you're left with just a bunch of predators at the end. But then everything has to either die or go away at the end of the hydro period. So what's actually happening to the trophic structure? Well, remember that these crustaceans were really all doing the same thing. So we have some pretty low trophic structure throughout the beginning of the hydro period. As more and more insects colonize, though, they bring in new trophic strategies until we get some peak. But then, because everything is predators, it goes down. Okay. What happens then to food chain length might be the food chain length gradually increases, and then towards the end, where all these predators are eating everything, it gets really high, and then you get a bunch of cannibalism here to further inflate the food chain length. But then all these organisms die out, and we get nothing at the end. So really what we're seeing is time is determining the aspect of the trophic structure, but it's mediated by who is there at the time. So what I say here is, the trophic structure is determined by time, but then it really depends on who is there at that specific time. So because only crustaceans run there in the beginning, and then we get more insects to increase the complexity of the trophic structure. So that's why I say it's the trophic structure is mediated by the assemblage identity. So what's happening with cows? Well, we might actually see an increase a little bit. I didn't really find that many differences between the grazed wetlands and the not, but I'm looking into that a little bit more currently. But what we see is when we put corn either in or right alongside, or wheat right alongside these wetlands, it really depresses the complexity, where the food chains aren't as long, the food webs aren't themselves as complex. So with that, I'll kind of leave it at that. And so now you should go and read the PLQ paper and take the quiz on it. And hopefully this gives you a little bit more insight into, again, how a community ecologist can work and go through the whole kind of like scientific method. Also gives you, pictures of me, oh gosh, now 9-10 years ago here. So enjoy those pictures. But with that, I'll leave you and see y'all later.